In this video, we'll be replacing the engine torque strut mount on this 2007 Mazda CX-9. So because we're on a lift, we're going to be working underneath the vehicle, which means our lift support on our transmission is going to be slightly different than yours. Underneath the vehicle here, we're going to put a pole jack on our transmission housing to keep our transmission up while we remove bolts for our mount. We're going to use a pole jack to do that. We'll put our pole jack in place. What we're going to do is raise our pole jack until we make contact with the transmission housing, and then just raise it a little more, maybe a half turn or a full turn. That's about all you need. Now we can start removing the bolts. If you're working on the ground, you're going to put a floor jack underneath the vehicle here. You can put a piece of 2x4 or a piece of wood between the floor jack and your transmission case so you don't do any damage. But the goal is to support your transmission up just a little bit while you remove the mount. So now underneath the vehicle, on the passenger side of our mount here, we can see we have this bracket. This bracket's going to be held in by two 12mm bolts and one large bolt on the top. We'll do the two 12mm bolts first. What that'll do is give us access to this bolt hiding right behind here, which is in the front portion. We'll need to remove it. So we'll start with our two 12mm bolts. And then our top bolt here, it's going to be a 19mm. It's going to be the last bolt holding on this bracket. There's your top 19mm. And there's your bracket. So now to remove our mount here, we're going to have a bolt facing the passenger side into a captured nut, and we're going to have a bolt facing the driver's side into a captured nut. We'll start on the rear bolt. Going to be they're both going to be 17mm. So on the back side here, on that nut, we're going to use a 17mm. All right, so on the back side here, or the driver's side, we have our nut and our little bumper or isolator. We can set aside. We can also take our bolt right out. So now we have our two bolts holding in our mount removed. So we're going to take a pry bar, get in the front, and we're going to push our mount down and out of the front position. We can take that same pry bar and push the two side tabs here open. Pull our mount downward. So in here where our mount is going to go, we're just going to use a wire brush and clean up both inside areas. So now we're going to take our mount. We're going to put the back in first, which means that we're going to have to spread this bracket open just a little bit to get our new mount in there. All right, so we're going to try and get our mount into the bracket. We're going to use a pry bar. Once you get your bolt lining here through or into the bracket, we can come back with a little rubber mallet, just seat that in a little further. And there we have our bracket around our mount. And then the next step is just going to be push straight up, and we're going to do the same thing in front. Now this is very close. Just give it a little nudge in. We're going to have to align our bolt holes. So now to keep our mount in place, we're actually going to just put our back bolt through. And that's going to thread right into that captured nut on the other side. Now we've worked our front mount bushing into place. We now have to work to get the hole actually centered so we can get our bolt through. So we're just going to use a pry bar here for this and get that mount. So what has happened is the motor has swung just a little bit and our mount is a little bit too far back for the hole. So we're just going to pry around a little bit here and get those two lined up. Once we have our hole lined up, we're going to take our bolt and send our bolt through. On the opposite side of that bolt, we are going to put our bumper here onto that stud and this little arm between these two notches. And now we can put our nut on. While you're doing this, if you can get this to snug up by hand, great. You just want to make sure that this little notch or this little arm is in those two spots there so it doesn't move around. All right, so we're going to snug this bolt up. We're going to snug up the back bolt as well. Now the back bolt should be a captured nut on one side. We can just snug this right up. All right, now before we put our bracket here covering our forward bolt, we're going to torque these down. It's going to be a 17 millimeter and we're going to torque it down to 50 foot-pounds. And we'll come up front here to our next bolt. We're going to torque this bolt down. So our bracket is actually kind of rusty, but we're still going to reuse it. It's going to go back in, and then we're going to put our bolt through. We had to loosen our front bolt to move our bracket slightly to get this top bolt to thread in. All right, so now we've gotten close. We're going to realign our bracket into position and snug up this bolt, and then we'll torque both of these big bolts down together. So our two bolts up top here that actually hold this bracket into the transmission, we're going to torque them down to 50 foot-pounds. And now to wrap this up, we have two more bolts on this bracket. Go ahead and start those. And these bolts are going to be 12 millimeter. All right, so now that we're done with our mount, we can now release our pole jack, or in your case, your floor jack, and lower down your transmission. You shouldn't notice it lowering much. You shouldn't notice much movement. If you do, go ahead and check that your bolts are all tight. Once you're good, go ahead and take your jack right out.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.